I have a daughter named Petra who is 9 years old and collects rocks. Not pretty rocks, ugly ones. Chunks of gravel with one interesting vein. River stones that look like nothing until you hold them to the window. She keeps them in an old canned goods tin, and she can tell you exactly where each one came from, down to which section of the docking yard. That is what I was thinking about when they threw me into the holding block at Veyrath Station. My kid and her rocks, and whether anyone had thought to water the green leaf she planted on our kitchen shelf. I was not thinking about the cub. The paperwork on me said I'd removed salvage materials from a secure impound lot. The paperwork was wrong, but Veyrath's intake officers don't read carefully when the accused is a human and the complaining party is a shipping consortium with 400 registered vessels. So they booked me, stripped my tools, and walked me down a corridor of graded flooring, and they put me in holding cell 14. There was already something in it. I didn't see it at first. The cell was lit by a single amber strip along the ceiling, and the back wall was shadow. I set my kit bag down. They let me keep the bag, and I sat on the lower bunk, and then I heard the sound, a low, resonant exhale like a bellows slowly releasing. Rhythmic, not threatening, more like something settling. I said quietly, "Hello." The spotted cub came out of the back corner like a tide coming in. That's the only way I can describe it. Not rushing, not cautious, just steady and absolute, as though the space between us was already hers and she was simply taking possession. She was big enough that her shoulders came level with my knee when she sat, and her coat was the color of river clay, with black rosettes the size of my palm. Her eyes were amber, same shade as the ceiling strip, and they found my face and stayed there. I said, "Easy, cub." She put her chin on my knee. I found out later, after everything, that she'd been confiscated from a Valori freighter 3 weeks prior. Improper transport documentation. Someone had filed to have her transferred to a wildlife authority on the outer ring, but the transfer orders had gone into a queue, and queues at Veyrath Station move the way glaciers move. She had been in holding cell 14 for 22 days. The guards had been sliding food through the lower grate. None of them had gone in. I didn't know any of that. I just knew she'd put her chin on my knee and was looking at me with the particular focused calm of a creature that has already decided something. I scratched behind her nearest ear very gently. She closed her eyes. I said, "All right, we'll figure it out. This is the part one have to be careful about when I tell it, because I don't want it to sound like I knew what was coming." I didn't. I was a mechanic with a wrongful impound charge and a 9-year-old waiting at home. I scratched a confiscated cub's ears because it seemed like the decent thing to do, and she let me, and that was the whole of it for the first 2 days. She slept at the foot of the bunk. She ate from the tray. They pushed through the grate with the same quiet deliberateness. She did everything. When I paced, and I paced because the cell was 8 feet by 10 and the hearing was 4 days out, she tracked me with her eyes but didn't move the way a good dog watches a man think through a problem. On the third morning, shift supervisor Harnack came down the corridor with 2 of his guards. Harnack had been the one who booked me. He was the kind of man who is comfortable when everyone around him is slightly afraid. I had not been afraid at intake. I'd been annoyed, which is different, and he'd noticed. He had the look of someone waiting for a reason to revisit that conversation. He opened the outer gate and came into the cell. His 2 guards stayed in the corridor with their hands on their sidearms. He looked at the cub. He looked at me. He said, "Enjoying your pet?" I said I didn't have a pet. I had a bunkmate. He smiled at that, which was a signal I missed in the moment. He bent down, picked up the cub's food tray from the floor. It was empty. She'd eaten an hour before, and he threw into the back wall hard enough to ring like a bell. The cub came off the floor in a single motion, every muscle under that clay-colored coat going rigid at once. She put herself between me and Harnack without any instruction from me, and the sound she made was low and continuous and went in through her back teeth. Harnack kicked her, not hard. That almost made it worse. It was contemptuous, a move designed to show her she was a thing you could move with your foot. She didn't move. She turned her head and looked at him. Then she turned her head back toward the floor grate at the rear of the cell. I will tell you what none of the incident report language could adequately convey. The floor grate at the rear of cell 14 was rated for 700 kilograms of pressure load. I know this because I'm a mechanic, and I looked up the station schematics afterward. 700 kilograms is a reasonable spec for a holding cell. The problem is that the number only matters if whatever is pushing against it weighs less than 700 kilograms. The cub's mother did not weigh less than 700 kilograms. The grate came up the way a cellar door comes up, one edge lifting first, then the whole thing folding back. What came through was enormous and deliberate and did not hurry. She moved the way her daughter moved, like the space already belonged to her. Her shoulders were at my chest height. Her coat was the same river clay with the same black rosettes, just larger. Each rosette was the size of a dinner plate. She looked at her daughter first. She looked at Harnack second. Harnack backed into the outer gate. The outer gate was closed. He'd closed it behind him when he came in, which had seemed, at the time, like a demonstration of confidence. I put my hand flat on the cub's back and said quietly, "Easy." The cub leaned into my hand. Why know about moments like that? Is there decided before anyone speaks? The mother had come up through a floor grate she'd been working on for 3 weeks because her daughter had been in this room for 3 weeks, and 2 days ago her daughter had stopped pacing and started sleeping at the foot of a bunk. Something in that math had changed what the mother was willing to do. She had waited until there was something she needed to answer for. She answered for it. Harnack and his 2 guards were not seriously injured. I want to be precise about that, because I'm not telling a story about carnage. The mother moved them out of the corridor in the same way you'd move furniture you had strong feelings about, efficiently, with finality, and with a clear sense of where you wanted it to end up. The guards ended up in the empty cell across the hall. Harnack ended up in the corridor junction at the far end of the block, sitting against the wall, and he was sitting there when the emergency response team arrived 8 minutes later. 8 guards responded to the breach alert. None made it past the corridor junction. The mother was sitting in the corridor by then, the cub beside her, and I was standing behind the cub with my hand still resting on her back. The station commander came down himself. He was a measured man, Commander Idris Fawn, and to his considerable credit, he looked at the situation for a long moment before he said anything. He said, "Reyes, are you all right?" I said I was fine. He looked at the mother. He looked at the cub. He looked at my hand, still resting between the cub's shoulder blades. He said, "Is there a term for what we're looking at here?" One of the younger guards, barely past cadet rank, standing at the back of the cluster, said very quietly, "Quiet claim, sir," like it was a thing you were supposed to know. Commander Fawn looked at him. The guard went red to the ears, but didn't take it back. Fawn looked at me again. He said, "The transfer order for the cub's been in queue for 3 weeks." I said I knew. He said, "I can have it pushed through by end of shift." I thought about Petra and her ugly rocks. I thought about the cub sleeping at the foot of the bunk, already certain. I said, "Sir, with respect, the transfer order is the problem I'd like to discuss." Fawn was a measure man, as I said. He measured the situation once more. Then he said, "My office. Bring the cub." The charges against me were dismissed before evening. I walked out of Veyrath Station in the company of a 9-month-old spotted cub who kept pace with me like we'd been doing it for years. The mother was behind us both, not looming, not threatening. Just there, steady and absolute, the way her daughter was, the way they both were. Petra met us at the docking bay entrance. She looked at the cub for one long moment, then crouched down and said, very seriously, "I have rocks I can show you." The cub put her chin on Petra's knee. "Some things you don't need to explain."